Okay, let us go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Hannah Chapman. I'm the Theodore Romanoff Assistant Professor of Russian Studies and an Assistant Professor of International and Area Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. First, I'd like to take a moment to thank both the Department of International and Area Studies and the Romanoff Center for Russian Studies for sponsoring this event. So on March 22nd, China's top leader, Xi Jinping, wrapped up a state visit to Russia, where he spent 3 days meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. This visit came about just a few days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin on alleged war crimes committed during Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Now, this visit between Xi and Putin has been viewed by the international community as a strong sign of support from China for Russia, and one which is aimed at deepening the political and economic relations between these two countries. Moreover, this visit represents a trend in recent years in which Russia has been pursuing deeper ties with China, which it sees as a potential partner in the midst of Russia's growing global isolation. However, this relationship is not without its tensions. Key amongst these is China's growing influence in Central Asia, a region that Russia considers part of its so-called sphere of influence. Which brings us really to our topic of conversation for today. So here to talk with us about Sino-Russian relations in Central Asia amid the war in Ukraine is Bradley Jardine. So Mr. Jardine is the managing director of the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs based in Washington, D.C. He is a political analyst and a former journalist who's been working on the ground to document China's growing economic and security presence in the countries of the former Soviet Union, including Central Asia. And his long list of very impressive credentials, Mr. Jardine is a fellow at the Wilson International Center for Scholars and also previously served as an editor of the Moscow Times and as a correspondent for Eurasianet. If you're not familiar with these publications, I highly recommend checking them out. They are absolutely excellent in their coverage of the region. Mr. Jardine's work has appeared in various outlets, including the Washington Post, the Guardian, Time, Atlantic, Wall Street Journal, BBC, and Embassy, among many others. And more recently, he authored a book on the Great Wall of Steel, China's global campaign, to suppress the Uyghurs. So today, Mr. Jardine will speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we will open the floor to a Q&A. As before, we will be using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. I will be collecting questions, and then I will be moderating the discussion. So if at any point during the talk and our discussion, if you have any questions, please do feel free to pop that into the chat. We've also been having a couple of technical issues today. So unfortunately, we are not able to share slides. However, I will be putting in the chat a link to Google Slides that you can peruse throughout the talk that'll go over some of the material of the discussion today. So if you can go ahead, that is now in the chat and you can click on it at your convenience. Okay, so with no further ado, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Jardine. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks a lot for the introduction, Hannah. And yeah, really excited to be here or virtually be present in Oklahoma. And yeah, the topic of discussion, we're going to look at Sino-Russian relations. Of course, this has been profoundly impacted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. China and Russia appear to be growing closer together. And the reason really Central Asia is an interesting case study for really assessing where the relations are at are, as Hannah outlined, Russia views this historically as its sphere of influence. It has something of a neo-colonial influence in the region. And over the years, China's really been chipping away at this influence. It's been building its own presence, most successfully economically, but as I'll show throughout this discussion, also as a major security actor, and now the number 2 security actor in the region. And as Russia's presence weakens, it's likely that China will grow as the dominant economic and potentially security provider as well. So those dynamics are interesting. It's often viewed in the West as a potential so-called wedge between the two countries. people think that Central Asia may be a region in which the equilibrium, the relations between the two reaches a point of tension in which China becomes more of a competitor than an ally. But as my presentation will make clear, I kind of disagree with this narrative. I actually see a lot of cohesion in their approach to the region and a general convergence of their grand strategy ambitions. And I think Central Asia really shows where this competition can actually turn into a synergy, and where China can actually fill some of the capacity gaps caused by Russia's long-term decline as an economic actor, and potentially now brought on by the conflict in Ukraine as a security provider as well. So to get started, I guess we should outline, where does Russia stand in the region since its invasion of Ukraine last year? Now, unlike most observers expected, where they thought that there would be a sudden plummet in economic activity and so on caused by sanctions and just general severance of ties and concentration of resources and energy in the European front, there was a lot of expectation that Russia's economic presence would collapse along with its political presence. But actually, the economic indicators show the opposite. Actually, Russian trade with the region has expanded quite dramatically, up to 30% in some cases, and diplomatic activity has expanded exponentially. There have been something of around 50 or so high-level visits in the past year, which is pretty unprecedented. This is a region that Russia's kind of been accused of neglecting for an extremely long time, and all of a sudden there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity as Russia seeks to shore up support for its conflict. Now, Central Asia, of course, has its own aims. The regimes, none of them have expressed any support for the conflict. And this is similar with 2014, where there's no regions that recognize any of Russia's annexed territories in Ukraine or Crimea, and the Donbass as well. So the region has retained its neutrality in the conflict, and this makes sense for its own interests. It wants to oppose the conflict as far as it can, because many of them have their own security fears. Kazakhstan has a large Russian population that's far north. Often there are some flare-ups of nationalist activity there, of Russians who could potentially push for separatism or unification with Russia. So that's always a long-standing fear since the 1990s with independent Kazakhstan. There have been flare-ups on Russia propaganda channels online, or even by Russian officials, actually, where they, including Putin himself, who deny the viability of Kazakhstan as a state, or who make neo-imperial comments, which of course provokes a lot of tension within Kazakh society and a lot of fear and suspicion. Nevertheless, Russia is still the dominant security provider for Kazakhstan. And we saw this kind of dramatically last January, where there were mass protests in Kazakhstan, and there was instability with the regime, and the regime called in the CSTO framework of Russian security to help prop up the regime in the face of these protests. So we see that when the political situation reaches a point of instability, Russia still remains the guarantor of regime stability. Now, China had made some bids to provide assistance as well, but ultimately it's still to Russia to which the regimes turn in a time of crisis. So I think that's important because that shows you the degree to which Russia still remains in many ways the key political broker in the region, even if China is emerging as a competitor. Now, other things alongside the continued economic trade with the region, the diplomatic activity, there's of course a very large diaspora population of Central Asians who go to Russia to work. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan all send between them large chunks of their population each year as migrant laborers. So this is an important source of income and investment, foreign direct investment and so on within the Central Asian economies. A lot of them are really dependent on offsetting tensions. Of course, if you have a large unemployed segment of the population, that can be a source of instability. But by exporting that potential instability to Russia, where they find labor and employment, Of course, it brings economic advantages, but also helps remove a potentially destabilizing political force within the country. So that kind of interconnection of the economic and security dimension with that aspect is another point of long-standing support provided by Russia for the regime stability and security. And there's no large-scale transfer of population the same way with China, where work opportunities remain largely limited, which is partly one of these differences in their approach to the region, where China really hasn't opened up its space for Central Asian migrant labor to the scale Russia has, which is an area where there's a lot less people-to-people contacts. And then finally, with the conflict itself, there have been a number of indicators of activity related to the conflict directly. For example, there's been a 7-fold increase in purchases from Kyrgyzstan of lenses for the scopes of rifles. There have been a large spike in activity of purchases of basically household appliances from the European Union to Kazakhstan, which intelligence officials suspect is to remove the microchips from those appliances that can be repurposed for weapons, and a number of other economic activities through Central Asia as a potential proxy region that's being bolstered for purposes of the war. And another stark example is, of course, the same migrant workers that have been going to Moscow. There have been incidents in which some of those have been found directly in the conflict, where Russia has essentially forced some of these migrant workers to go to the front lines. This is, of course, a major source of tension in Central Asia, and also a lot of people who go as migrant workers now have this sense of fear that they may be sent to the conflict as well, which has not helped Russia's soft power presence in the region. Nevertheless, with all of this new activity and by the huge political aftershocks caused by the conflict, my argument is essentially that the trajectory that Central Asia is on, the decline of Russian influence in Central Asia, and the spike in Chinese activity, I think the war has been less of a watershed moment than many suspected it would be. I think that the long-term trajectory has been China's rise and Russia's slow receding from the region. And I think that the conflict, while it's served as an accelerator, it hasn't really challenged that overall dynamic or sped it up to such a significant degree that it would be seen as a watershed moment. And Russia, as I've noted with the general lay of the land currently, still retains a lot of influence through migrant labor. It's still the major source through which the political elites continue to train and be educated in Moscow. It's still the largest provider of arms and weapons transfers in the region. And it will continue to be a major player in the region, even if it's being chipped away at. So if you've opened the slides and you turn to the third slide, this is really where I'll talk about the emergence of China as a security actor. So you can see that ultimately Russia is still far and away the largest provider of security technology in the region, so military and security technology. China currently stands accounting for around 10% of the security market. Now, this is a major shift over the past 10 to 15 years. About 15 years ago, China accounted for less than 1% of Central Asia's defense sector. Part of this is like macroeconomic trends. Of course, China was not really a large-scale weapons manufacturer in its own right over a decade ago. In fact, most of its arms come from Russia and continue to do so. But over the years, China's been reverse engineering a lot of Russian technology and building its own variants of those same weapon systems, which Russia's aware of. Russia's gambled that long-term, the profits made from transferring this technology in the short term is better than losing out to China in the long term, which it probably would do anyway as China builds up its defense sector. So although there's awareness that China's reverse engineering a lot of this technology, Russia has gambled that it still seeks short-term profits from those sales and transfers. The long-term effect of this has been that China's become now a major global arms exporter. So it's unsurprising that it's also emerging as a key exporter, even in a region that's so heavily dependent on Russia. And a lot of those arms systems are also interoperable as well. The Chinese systems actually fit within a lot of the old Soviet systems that countries there continue to use. So there are a lot of strategic advantages that China has over NATO and NATO allies. So are Russia and China in competition? Well, when you look at the arms market, China's shares expanded to 10% from 1%. But rather than actually challenging Russia's shares actually remained quite stable these past 3 decades. The countries that are being pushed out are actually Turkey, Italy, and Spain, and countries that are NATO members. So this is kind of an example where it looks like there's growing competition between Russia and China, but actually when you start to break down the numbers, China's actually building its presence, but it's actually pushing out other actors. So you see this convergence of grand strategy here, which is reduced NATO influence in a strategic and potentially volatile region. So both of them are really supporting one another's objectives, even if China is gaining a strategic advantage in building its own arms exports in the region. And if you turn to slide 4, it's a similar trend when it comes to military training and joint training exercises. China has increased dramatically in terms of its both bilateral training, but also working through multilateral frameworks. China does training exercises through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which Russia is also a member, but also increasingly runs its own bilateral exercises. This has been an interesting development where historically China's always sought Russian buy-in for a lot of its security activities and its diplomatic and multilateral frameworks, which Russia used to always be a member of. Over the past, since 2016, there's been a shift where China is now increasingly establishing its own frameworks, independent of Russia and excluding the membership of Russia. The first example of this was the QCCM, which is, it's got the very cumbersome name, which is the Quadrilateral Coordination and Cooperation Mechanism. What that really is it's a way for China to control its border region, controlling specifically the Afghan-Tajik Pakistan border. That framework is a border security cooperation mechanism that involves those 4 countries working together to patrol the Wakhan corridor, which borders with those countries and connects to China's Xinjiang province, which I'll go into in a moment about what China's security interests in the region actually are. And the other mechanism which emerged during the pandemic in 2020 is the China plus C5. Again, this is another mechanism through which China interacts with the governments of Central Asia, but this is a mechanism that excludes Russia. And interestingly, it's the only framework in the region that includes Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan's, as some of you may know, it's an extremely isolationist state that adheres to a policy of strict neutrality. So it doesn't participate in any of these major security frameworks. But China's managed to bring it within its recent entity, which is a symbol of China's ambitions to really become a real diplomatic broker in the region. And potentially the C plus C5 could evolve to moving from the heads of ministers of foreign affairs level to the heads of state level. That's one of the sort of developments that's in place within that framework. So China's interests in Central Asia, Russia's, of course, we can talk about its historical colonial legacies, its Soviet legacies as well. And it's got a lot of historic and cultural ties with the region. China's had more of a complex relationship with Central Asia. And the real framework and lens through which China views its relations here is for the domestic security of its westernmost province of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So many of you are probably aware that Xinjiang is featured very heavily in the news in headlines of late due to China's post-2017 mass repression campaign, the mass internment of Turkic and predominantly Muslim minority peoples, not just Uyghurs, but also ethnic Kazakhs and Kyrgyz. Now in Central Asia, across the border, there's a large Uyghur diaspora community there as well of some 300,000. We have various points of instability throughout China's history, from the Cultural Revolution under Mao, the Great Famine that took place as well, and even up to recent crackdowns. Some of the refugees fled to Kazakhstan, and at various points of tension between the Soviet Union and China, who in the 1960s had a large geopolitical shift where China pivoted toward the United States and the Soviet Union became an adversary. So the Soviet Union would often support these refugee flows and try to support Uyghur activist organizations and groups that China began to fear were fomenting instability within Xinjiang itself. So there's been a long-standing historical tension on those borderlands and concerns and fears from the Chinese side about the potential for a politicized Uyghur diaspora emerging. So post the Soviet collapse, China really worked to build diplomatic and political relationships with the newly emerged post-Soviet republics. Part of this was its strategy to pacify this potentially restive Uyghur diaspora population. So initially, when China set up the Shanghai Five grouping, this is the predecessor to what we know now today as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China started by reopening border negotiations. There'd been long-standing territorial disputes between China and the Soviet Union at the time over some of the borders in Central Asia. So one of the early diplomatic maneuvers China sought to build goodwill with the newly emergent republics with was resolving those long-standing disputes and resolving them in a manner where China gained some territory, but conceded large chunks of its claims as a way to allow the regimes to, retain face in the face of their populations, and to be allowed to score it essentially as a diplomatic victory, which most of them did. But a lot of them were, of course, controversial, particularly in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, for these early border negotiations. Some of the population were deeply displeased by the results. But today those borders are stable, and it can be chalked up to being a diplomatic victory both for China and for the region. So this early goodwill also built political favor for the closing off of Uyghur civil society organizations. So very quickly from the mid-1990s onward, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan began closing down Uyghur museums, cultural associations, and diaspora newspapers and such things. These were all closed as part of the deals and agreements that were taking place with China. So China very early on began to securitize its discourse on the Uyghurs and wanted to ensure what it called was combating separatism at the time. Post-war on terror, this became an anti-terror movement. So you really see this huge shift post-2001 where communications between Central Asia and between China constantly referring to criminal organizations or separatist organizations. After 2001, it becomes almost exclusively terrorist organizations. So you see how China shifts its diplomatic rhetoric to fit the framework at the time, which allows international or local regional buy-in for its own campaign of domestic repression on a minority population. And this fit within the developments in Central Asia at the time. Uzbekistan in particular had moments of instability. The regime went on a very aggressive secular direction of closing off religious groups and what it called its own anti-terror campaign, which led to the arrest of many innocent people, but of course there were genuine causes for concern as well. China took advantage of this, as did the regime in Uzbekistan, and they proposed this merging of security concepts, which became the SCO's three evils of separatism, extremism. And essentially, this was emerging in recognition of one another's mutual security interests. Of course, the Taliban regime in Afghanistan was a cause of concern at the time as well. So the SCO really began to evolve into this security entity that China continues to use to pursue its own interests, but also has mechanisms for deportations. So across the SCO, there's now a mutual so-called terror list, which is essentially anyone who's deemed to be a potential threat to one of the regimes. They can request, if that person happens to be residing in the territory of another SCO member, they can request their extradition, and it's essentially a no questions asked quid pro quo. If Uzbekistan requests a dissident who happens to be located in China, he will be deported, and so on for China. So this became a mechanism for closing off space for independent Uyghur society. And a lot of the final remaining activists from the 1990s, they have since fled to Istanbul, and the Uyghur diaspora community was effectively silenced. Now, coming up to the present, 2014, so all these details, this is where the foreign policy becomes important. So looking at the growth of China as an arms exporter and as a security actor in Central Asia, it escalates dramatically after 2014. So two major events happened, in the year preceding. The first is at 2013, Xi Jinping visits Kazakhstan, where he announces the Belt and Road Initiative. Belt and Road Initiative, of course, is China's global framework for trade to create a China-centric global logistics and trade network, increasing China's presence as an economic actor, and also doing some branding exercises. A lot of these developments that have since been branded as BRI were actually just long-standing bilateral trade initiatives, but creating this framework allowed for China establishing more of a global presence and a global brand. And Central Asia was chosen because of historic ties with the Silk Road, of course, but also as part of its own campaign within Xinjiang. So within Chinese leadership, stability within Xinjiang has always been linked to economic development. Since the 80s, when China began liberalizing its economy, there'd been massive growth, huge economic opportunities that's turned China into the economic and political powerhouse it is today. But what a lot of people don't understand is that the growth was very imbalanced. While the coastal provinces are Han-dominated, China's dominant ethnic group, really became fully developed modern cities and modern trade centers, a lot of the generally ethnic minority populated regions such as Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and Xinjiang fell behind, and there were mass inequalities that emerged, which was creating a lot of political tensions and instability. And we saw that most markedly in 2009, what are known as the Urumqi riots in Xinjiang, where there was years of resentment over the model of development that China pursues, which is often bringing in Han workers, ethnic Han, into Xinjiang, where they resettle and are giving parcels of agricultural land, often at the expense of local Turkic minority populations, who very rarely get part of that economic activity. A lot of it concentrates on the energy sector, which they're often excluded from jobs from. So there was this huge wealth divide, which created tensions, and this was really exacerbated in 2008 with the Beijing Olympics, where China began to worry about security, the prospect of terrorist activities on its territory, and it responded with very harsh measures of repression within Xinjiang. So these two tensions, the economic and the security tension, came to a head in 2009, and there was an incident of mass unrest. And this resulted in another huge population outflow from Xinjiang of some 30,000 people. So the Belt and Road, seen as a development centerpiece for rebalancing Xinjiang's economy, this is where China and Central Asia become important economic allies. In the grand scheme of things, trade with Central Asia is very minimal in China's overall trade portfolio. But when you look at it from a regional portfolio, it accounts for the majority of Xinjiang's trade. So you look at these strategic economic interests that China has in developing Xinjiang, you start to understand why Central Asia plays almost an outsized role in China's strategic thinking because of its very specific historical political connections with Xinjiang, and of course the vast contiguous borders that it shares with Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Now, on the other side of this is the security development. So, of course, there were these huge refugee flows from Xinjiang post 2009. And in 2013, there began to emerge first signs of evidence that Uyghur-linked organizations may be present in the conflict in Syria. So the prospect of Uyghur fighters gathering in Syria has led to a flurry of security initiatives within China and also in its approach to Central Asia as well. So in 2014, Xi Jinping, we know this now post 2019 with the leak of the Xinjiang papers, he made a speech where he talked about the prospect of fighters returning from Syria and setting up camps either in Central Asia or in Afghanistan. China and Afghanistan share a very small border, and this border is part of a narrow parcel of land that's known as the Wakhan corridor. This borders with Tajikistan, but also with Pakistan. So with this 2014 speech, China begins announcing calls it's going to start developing border security arrangements with Tajikistan. It's going to start developing border posts there. And in 2016, we see the first emergence in the region and one of the few instances, one of only 3 worldwide, of a Chinese strategic facility, a base of some sort. It's not really a military base, it's more of a reconnaissance facility, and it's connected with the Communist Party's paramilitary wing called the People's Armed Police. This today, you can see it in my picture, in pictures 5 and 6. I actually visited the site there 4 months ago when I was doing some field work in Central Asia. So you can see this reconnaissance facility. It has soldiers from Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, and Tajikistan who are all stationed together and run joint patrols and exercises in the Wakhan corridor. So this is part of China's efforts to basically insulate Xinjiang from external influence and for these fears of potential fighters, which have of course been intensified since the fall of Kabul and the rise of the Taliban regime. So Tajikistan, despite its very minor economic or even political role, it's become this very important link within China's overall sense of its security in the region. So there's been a huge increase in Chinese activity there. And this has brought some tensions with Russia. Russia was apparently displeased at the idea of China setting up border facilities and a base in Tajikistan. They in the end relented, which I think is largely that they ultimately share a common goal in keeping Central Asia stable, propping up the regimes, and preventing instability spillover from Afghanistan. So I think there's a real convergence of goals there. And this is part of the grand strategy that they both share, that those tensions that may emerge from China's growing security activities, ultimately they fall under when they're put up against the grander geostrategic ambitions of Russia and China challenging the West or challenging more directly the United States. It's unlikely that a region like Central Asia is going to create this huge wedge between those grander geostrategic ambitions, even if there may be upticks in resentment between the two sides or some tensions. They'll usually find a way to accommodate one another. And as I pointed out, the arms transfers, which also spiked dramatically post 2014, it hasn't really become a major source of tension with Russia so far. Although, as I also noted, China's not really challenged Russia so far. At the moment, it's been pushing out Western aligned actors. So post 2014, this is really when China is emerging as a security actor. The situation in Xinjiang is, of course, the central lens through which China engages with the region, both economically, politically, and in terms of security. But post 2017, there's a real tension between China's economic agenda and also its harsh security agenda in Xinjiang, which most infamously has mass detention centers. This created a huge backlash for China because those detention centers also involved detaining thousands of Kazakhs and Kyrgyz as well. And many of those are part of cross-border networks. A lot of these ethnic Kazakhs would do trade and shuttle runs within Kazakhstan, same for Kyrgyzstan. Suddenly, people's relatives are now disappearing into mass detention centers. So this started to spread quite widely in Kazakh and Kyrgyz social media. And there was quite a flurry of critical activity. Now, there's always been a Sinophobic tendencies across Central Asia. There's deep skepticism of China, even from my own interactions across the region. Unlike Russia, which still has large cultural presence, linguistic advantages, in that Russian is still widely spoken. A lot of people still continue to go to Russia to be educated. China's a relatively new actor in the region. There are Central Asians who are learning Mandarin, but they're very small numbers. Chinese culture is far less spread than Russian is. People aren't watching as much in terms of, say, Chinese soap operas as they are with even from places like Turkey, where there's great affinity between Central Asia and Turkey, or with Russia for that matter, where Russia just has a far larger media imprint and a cultural footprint. And of course, as we mentioned, when there are millions of Central Asians going to live and work in Russia as migrant workers, that's huge people-to-people connectivity there that's just simply missing when it comes to China. So there's a kind of a vacuum of China's soft power influence in the region that often undermines its own security interests. And this vacuum was filled with a lot of critical information, of course, by people who were upset by China's mass re-education campaign and the repression that was taking place within Xinjiang. So this created a backlash, and there was a lot of Kazakh activism. And so the Chinese government sought to bridge its relations with the Kazakh government to suppress a lot of this dissent. So this is really what we see, where there's a huge gap between China's relationships with the governments of Central Asia, where it has a lot of influence and a lot of government insiders and officials who are very pro-Chinese, and the broader population who remain quite skeptical, or even in some cases quite hostile towards China's presence in the region. And this often is a point of tension between the governments and their population. And the situation with Xinjiang exacerbated this for a brief period where you really saw those two tensions in direct conflict. Now, Russian soft power is also in decline. So I would say that one of the big changes that's come with the conflict in Ukraine has been growing skepticism of Russia's intentions. In the past, positive receptions of Russia were extremely high. Perceptions of China were quite negative. We're actually seeing them kind of reaching level points now, where there's increased negative discourse of Russia. There's a huge resurgence in post-colonial debate going on within Central Asia, particularly among elite urban circles. There's a lot of talk of decolonizing Central Asia. A lot of government officials are looking to basically deepen long-standing policies of multi-vectorism, where Central Asia sought to balance its external patrons to increase its own, give itself flexibility, diplomatic and economic flexibility. It's really doubled down on this initiative. We're seeing this as well, that there's concerns about Russia's role as a security provider post-conflict, which is creating more space for China. For example, the CSTO framework, which Russia works within, there's been a lot of backlash against that, because there was a spark in conflict between two of its members. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which entered a border conflict last year that got very violent. And Russia, of course, provided no assistance. This became a source of tension with Kyrgyzstan, which has had quite tense relations with the Russian government this past year. Similarly, in Armenia and Azerbaijan, where there's been a huge flare-up over the Karabakh conflict, Russia's CSTO has failed to avert that conflict or support the Armenian side, which has been losing territory. So there's been a perception that Russia's failing as a security provider, and even its presence in Central Asia. Tajikistan continues to host Russia's largest overseas base, or the second largest base. Some of those soldiers were withdrawn, and they've since been found active in the Ukraine conflict. So a lot of these Russian bases are actually there and ostensibly set up to help protect Tajikistan's regime from instability in Afghanistan, from spilling across its borders. Those are actually a lot of the weapons systems, a lot of the personnel are being moved to the conflict, which has now led to Tajikistan's regime actively courting more Chinese presence. And now, in addition to the base that China's already set up in the region, there's discussions of a second and even a third base, China transferring surveillance drones as well to the border regions and having a larger presence in Tajikistan. And the two even last year signed a joint agreement that they'll conduct regular scheduled joint border patrols. So there's been an intensification of relations with China in the security sector. Similarly, Kazakhstan, which has been hugely dependent on Russia for over 85% of its security equipment, Kazakhstan is now looking to other markets. And China will likely play a key role in providing that diversification in terms of security. And other actors as well, such as Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, have been buying advanced weapon systems, some of those coming from China. And oftentimes China providing strategic systems that Russia doesn't provide, such as attack drones, which China's been providing to Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan in particular. So China's building a unique security profile in the region, and the conflict in Ukraine is really it's really pushing the regimes in the region to be pursuing more security partners. So this is creating a lot more space for China. And I think that Russia will have less tension over this than many would suspect, and largely again because I believe that they have a convergence of interests in propping up the regimes in the region, and they have a convergence of interests in preventing any instability from Afghanistan from leaking into the region. So if Russia is reducing its security capacity for its conflict in Europe, and China happens to fill some of that capacity gap, then that may serve ultimately Russian interests. The question is really whether China will fill that gap, or whether it's in China's ambitions to actually increase its security agenda. One of the key differences between the two actors and between the United States' engagement in Central Asia is that both Russia and the US have a much more refined grand strategy when it comes to the region and seeing it within its larger security ambitions, promoting peace and stability. China has much narrower interests. I would say that China is very domestically oriented. A lot of my discussion so far has focused on the fact that preserving stability in Xinjiang is really China's core motive for the region. And I think this means that it's more likely to pursue a very narrow engagement with the region as long as it can secure and isolate those border regions. And that's probably its primary short-term ambition in terms of security. It would depend on how unstable the region gets and whether some sort of perceived threat emerges that would pull China in for greater engagement. But so far, that doesn't appear to be the case. You can also see this in the data when you look at the military exercises. if you actually break down the joint exercises and drills that take place and which specific units, or particularly military branches, are engaged in them, the Chinese activities are almost overwhelmingly focused on counterterrorism exercises, and they often involve security services and Xinjiang internal policing services. So there's much more cooperation in terms of China expanding its own policing within Xinjiang into the region. Whereas Russia and the United States tend to focus on more high-level military services. They do interstate drills and grander military exercises where Central Asia's fit within their broader military objectives. China's doing far less PLA-style drills or integrating Central Asia within its broader military strategy. It's quite limited to just security and Xinjiang focus. Now that may change and evolve, but at present the data doesn't seem to indicate that China has grander strategic ambitions. So overall, yeah, the war on Ukraine has had tremendous impact on perceptions of Russia. It's had interesting economic effects. When we're talking about the people-to-people diplomacy, I should mention as well that although there are millions of Central Asian labor migrants going to Russia, one of the real profound changes of the conflict has been Russians who are fleeing the conflict or conscription who've been settling in Central Asian cities. And this has created a lot of backlash and tension, just as it has in regions like the South Caucasus, where locals accuse the Russians of driving up inflation. There's a lot of negative interactions where some Russians insist on using Russian language, for example, in a restaurant dispute rather than a local language, which results in a tense encounter or a viral video that spreads across local social media channels. So it's had kind of a negative effect on Russian soft power diplomacy, and it's enhanced perceptions locally of a sort of a colonial attitude being shown by Russia or by Russian citizens toward the local population. So that's had a profound shift on public perceptions of Russia. Maybe that will change. Maybe the local population will be more integration. Prices will stabilize. We'll see how that develops. But it's an interesting additional node of soft power outreach between Russia and the region, which again is missing when it comes to China, where there just simply aren't the large-scale transfers in terms of labor programs or in terms of cultural exchange, language programs, and training. And China just doesn't have that cultural foothold yet to really dislodge Russia, which is why my perception of the conflict, although it's an accelerant again for Russian decline, there's still a very long process to be underway for China or any other actor for that matter to dislodge Russia. China is, of course, the most deeply engaged with Central Asia. For the past decade, it's been the largest trade partner. Russian trade today, even at its peak post-war, is still only 2/3 that of China. So as an economic and a security provider, Russia's declining, but China, despite its huge economic gains and its security gains and ambitions, it still culturally remains very far behind. The real transition will be what happens with the elites. A lot of the Central Asian elites are still Soviet trained. They've known each other for decades. They go to Moscow and they look to Moscow in terms of security, culture, training. But there's a much younger generation. I mean, Central Asia is a very young region overall. And increasingly, the new elites are trained not just in China, but in the West and also in East Asia, particularly Korea and Japan. There's a large Korean presence within Uzbekistan in particular. So the elite's becoming a lot more diverse in its own orientations. And it will be interesting to see how they engage with Russia or what direction they take the country in the future. But ultimately, that's a more diverse elite than Russia inherited. And it's still very far from being China dominated. So despite China's material gains in the region, there's still those huge cultural divides. And so China's presence in the region, I would argue, is not really set or guaranteed either. Often there are flare-ups of tension and perceptions of Chinese workers in the region. They've actually resulted in quite severe economic pushback in some cases, such as the recent closing of a huge $250 million logistics terminal that was going to be built in Kyrgyzstan. That project was closed down after locals protested against the Chinese project. There are other instances of this as well, where Belt and Road linked infrastructure, and also particularly the mining sector, where Chinese mining companies are often accused of ecological damage to people's well-being in small communities. And this often acts as an accelerant for mobilization against China's economic activities. So there is pushback and there is tension. And unless China shifts to a more inclusive model of engagement that moves simply from the elite level interactions it's favored in the past toward a much more broader soft power people-to-people diplomacy, then its ambitions in the region could be stunted long-term. Particularly as we're seeing in Kyrgyzstan, we're seeing the rise of a nationalist populist regime. There could be other spikes in nationalist sentiments across the region as well. And it remains to be seen how those sort of political ideologies will perceive deepening relations with China. A lot of Chinese projects have been, especially Belt and Road Initiative, because of the opaque funding structures that they often pursue. There's a lot of room for corruption that's taking place within them, and even just perceptions of corruption itself. You know, if an opposition member is accusing elites of taking Chinese money, often that negative sentiment can actually spread over social media, and it becomes a source of potential instability for the Central Asian elites as well when they turn to China. So this tension between the local perceptions and elite perceptions will persist for some time, and it will be interesting to see whether China, as Russia starts to recede or as Russia starts to become a less popular actor, who will fill that gap, and whether China is willing to put the resources in place to start building that people-to-people diplomacy for better academic exchanges, investments, and such things. And I guess I could finish there, and we could open up for questions, because I guess it's a lot of material to take in. Many of you may not focus particularly on Central Asia, so I just want to make sure that we, address things that may be of specific interest to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bradley, for this really great and engaging talk. I think there's a lot there for us to pursue, and we indeed have many questions about many different parts of your talk. But one of the things that has come up a couple of times is the question of energy, right? So a lot of your discussion was based off of Russia and China's security relationship, which you characterized as, being more cooperative, and as China's presence not directly challenging Russia. Do you see a similar type of more cooperative rather than competitive relationship in the area of energy?
Yeah, I think the energy cooperation is an interesting question as well. And I would point out that something that's interesting is that Kazakhstan's oil exports, of course, they have to go through Russia. About 80% of them do. And Russia hasn't bullied Kazakhstan so far. It closed those off initially in the conflict, maybe to assert that it does have that mechanism at its disposal, but it has used that less on Kazakhstan, which I think shows its strategic weakness in that Russia really needs to bridge its relations with the region. It can't be seen as pushing them too far, too hard for support when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine. It just needs their diplomatic neutrality and so on. But more broadly, with China's relations, there've been a lot of competition, particularly over Turkmenistan historically, where China began building its vast pipelines. And you really see the dramatic shift that took place from something like 90% of Turkmenistan's exports from the 90s through to the early 2000s always went through Russia. But now China's the dominant purchaser. And even now with the conflict, I mean, one of the major takeaways now is that China's getting historic energy deals in its favor now with Russia that it's long struggled to get in place. So even Russia's now having to sell to China potentially to their advantage. I just wanted to address, there's a comment in here from Mustafa, which I think's really, really important point was that, of course, for the counterterrorism, to be clear, that's the framing for which China uses its narrative. There are plenty of evidence that this is not necessarily or anything related actually to counterterrorism. I mean, we're seeing, I would agree, it's a mass, it's a genocidal campaign of cultural extermination from preventing the expressions of Islamic culture, but also not even just Islamic culture, but secular Uyghur culture has also been repressed. And, putting further problems to China's narrative that's countering terrorism, also a large number of Uyghur and Kyrgyz Christian communities within Xinjiang who've also been sent to these so-called re-education centers. So there's plenty of ground for criticizing China's campaign and its long-standing colonial objectives in the region. But the important thing is just using its own rhetoric. That's how China frames its engagement with Central Asia and often gets regime buy-in from the region, even though there are those huge domestic discussions about the legitimacy of this campaign and people who are expressing and calling it genocide within Central Asia who are actually facing a lot of repression from the authorities and the security services for speaking out about the repression.
Yeah. Could you speak a little bit, since we're on that topic, about why there is this pushback from authorities about speaking out?
It's a huge point of tension for them. The relations are extremely complex, of course, where a lot of people have had the question for me these recent years of, why is there not more vocal response from Central Asia where there are so much cultural and linguistic affinities? But the unfortunate fact is that there's a lot of hostility also within Kazakh population, nationalist sentiments, where Uyghurs are often marginalized within Kazakhstan. They're often given less opportunities to integrate with society. And generally speaking, when Central Asians talk about the repression in Xinjiang, they're talking less about the Uyghur population than they are about their own ethnic kin, the ethnic Kazakhs and so on. So when Kazakhstan's been negotiating with China, it's been less about reducing repression in general, but calling for these back channel releases of Kazakh detainees, some of whom have resettled within Kazakhstan. So this is a form of appeasement toward the population. Of course, long-standing cultural links. Kazakhstan had a policy of accepting returnees from Xinjiang throughout the 90s to boost its population. So a lot of people in the 90s who moved to Kazakhstan had these long-standing historic links to Xinjiang and among communities there. So when those early border trades start to emerge from the 1990s onward, those economic links were between Kazakhs who have family in Xinjiang and also with Kyrgyz who have contacts there as well. So once the camps started to emerge, those networks were suddenly disrupted. People could no longer trade. People were concerned about the whereabouts of their relatives. So this became a point of domestic tension because, of course, when you're promoting nationalism and national solidarity and your ethnic kin across the border are in mass detention centers with your dominant economic trade partner, it becomes a major source of contention where oppositionists will start accusing the government of collaboration with a regime that's hostile to them and their culture. It just becomes a huge source of tension. So the regimes themselves were worried about speaking out against China, of course, in case that disrupts their economic interests, their own stability or security agenda. But at the same time, they had to walk this important tightrope of also listening to public concerns about what was happening to their relatives. So a lot of that has been done through diplomatic back channels rather than public discussions. I actually ran some regression analysis. So at Oxus Society, we track protests that take place across Central Asia. We map them geospatially. And one of the things that was interesting was that the regimes, especially Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, are far more likely to use violence against protesters if the protests involves China. So unlike environmental issues or even some of the anti-government protests, like anti-Kazakh government protests, the likelihood of violence being deployed is actually higher when it comes to China, which I think is a very interesting finding.
That is fascinating. I would love to see what you make of that. That is very, very interesting. As you very clearly illustrated, China does have a lot of security concerns with Central Asia, but beyond, security factors, you pointed out that China's relationship is primarily economic, that is their primary concern. I loved how you put it, that China has a vacuum of soft power in Central Asia, right? And I'm wondering, to what extent is China's emphasis on economic ties and its seeming lack of interest in building more diplomatic, political, cultural, and social ties in Central Asia, how much this contributes to the more cooperative rather than competitive relationship with Russia? And as a follow-up to that, do you see this relationship changing? Do you see China having more interest in the future of creating these greater cultural ties in Central Asia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, China itself, refers to its relations as hot politics, cold public. It's really referring to this sense that it's had a warm reception from governments where it interacts, and not just in Central Asia, but other parts of the world. Whereas the public tends to be kind of cold or even in some cases hostile. I think that part of this is just how China operates. Of course, it's an authoritarian system. It understands that to get things done, you aim for the top. It's almost a disdain for democracy or the need to have local buy-in when the population has very little influence or perceived influence over their government. And I think that probably was the case in the early years. But more recently, we're just seeing, especially with the advent of social media, where regimes actually do need a lot more buy-in and public support for a lot of their activities. And the same protest tracking data that I was citing, we've seen a huge uptick in recent years of protest activities across Central Asia, not just the huge events like Kyrgyzstan's government being overthrown. It's the third in the past 3 decades. But also just local small-scale protests. There's a lot more pushback and dynamism within authoritarian systems than people looking from the outside often give credit to. And I think that also includes China, which hasn't really taken domestic concerns very seriously in its engagements with authoritarian regions like Central Asia. But I think it increasingly understands that this public pushback is creating problems. It has resulted in huge setbacks in terms of its economic ambitions, and there are increasing talk between China and governments of the region of setting up protection, security of pipelines and key infrastructure for concern that those might become a target. So this has actually been an initiative in recent years where China is pushing for access for its own private security companies to be able to protect Chinese workers. Of course, we saw recently there was an attack in the Central African Republic on Chinese miners. This led to a huge speech from Xi Jinping in which he's condemning the violence and calling for repercussions for the people who committed those acts. Similar attacks have been happening definitely in Pakistan, which has been a huge source of attacks on Chinese workers, but also in Central Asia. When Kyrgyzstan's government fell into instability, a lot of Chinese workers were actually kidnapped. Some of them were beaten up, and over 300 of them were dragged into a forest in the middle of winter and stranded there. This creates huge embarrassment for both the local government, which fails to protect the citizens of its largest economic partner, also for the Chinese government, which is seen as losing some of its own legitimacy in terms of protecting its workers living overseas. So there's a lot more discussion and tension on that issue about how to monitor Chinese discourse. And one of the things that's been interesting, I would say, of the past year is there's a lot more discussion about China working with the regimes to control online discourse, and particularly addressing the idea of Sinophobia, the idea that there is a domestic hostile segment of the population which is undermining their cooperation together. So I think that the regime has definitely taken a lot more serious attitude toward this topic of the potential for xenophobic sentiments to turn violence or even hostile to its political interests. In terms of replacing Russia, as I say, it's just the gulf is so vast. Just when you look at the data on the number of students who are going to study in China versus Russia, it's vastly behind. China's investing a lot, in particular, of having security elites, people from local domestic security services, police, border guards, training in Chinese facilities. There's been an uptick in that sort of activity. There's also company, state-owned enterprise-led scholarships, particularly in the tech sector, where there have been efforts by companies like Huawei to set up local scholarships to take advantage of the well-educated Central Asian population. People who can work for Chinese companies based in the region. But ultimately, there's been no mass transition toward that level of cultural engagement. And there have been no indications that China will be shifting to that model. In fact, a lot of its Belt and Road projects seem to be scaling back. They're less of these large-scale top-down infrastructure projects, more toward. It could be beneficial in the sense that they're building more small-scale projects that actually have local companies as contractors as well. So there's a lot more engagement. Another thing that's been interesting is China's setting up Luban workshops, which are these technical training workshops. It's part of the negative perception of China is that, and I heard this all the time traveling around Central Asia recently, was that China's just extractive in the sense that it just takes natural resources. It has no interest in developing Central Asia's economy. So things like the Luban workshops are established ostensibly to help Central Asia move up the value production chain rather than just the extractive economy, but it moves to production. And China's actually trying to, as part of its broader conflict with the United States, is shifting away from dependency on exports and low-level manufacturing toward higher grade goods. This could actually see, as many people are expecting, a transition of Chinese factories and workshops moving to other regions with cheaper labor. This is something that Uzbekistan's kind of banking on, actually, with its very large and young population, that there's hope that China will move a lot of its manufacturing to a place like Uzbekistan. So that could have huge soft power implications as well.
So one of the things that, obviously Russia and China are kind of the dominant powers in Central Asia in many ways. But one of the things that I found interesting in my own experience in living in Central Asia is the increasing presence of Turkey as a player in the region. For example, there are numerous Turkish language schools. In Central Asia, you don't really see Chinese language schools in the same way. And there's also increasing economic investment. So one of our questions asked about the Turkic Investment Fund, which has been formed with participation with many of the states in Central Asia. If you could maybe just very briefly talk about what implications will this type of engagement from other powers have for Central Asia's relationship with China and with Russia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Central Asia, Turkey, of course, has a long historic, linguistic, and ethnic connection with the region. Turkey's engagement with the region kind of ebbs and flows depending on the agenda of the Turkish government. It switches between this pan-Turanist, pan-Turkic sort of ideology to the neo-Ottomanist, more Middle Eastern focused Turkish initiatives, or even European focused with the liberal branches. So Central Asia often crops up in terms of its prominence for Turkey. And the region, the local populations often, when I ask them about alternative partners to Russia, Turkey is always kind of the first preference. Again, because of the similarities they have, and also in terms of religious connectors as well. And the Gulf is also emerging as a key player. The Gulf states invest a lot in Central Asia. A lot of the religious revival of the mosque development and so on is funded from the Gulf states. So they also remain an important trade partner. Ultimately, though, Turkey, its size of its investments and its engagement with the region is so small that it's unlikely to dislodge Russia. It's really China's the only country that's expressed ambitions on a scale or investments on a scale that could fill that vacuum. I think that those countries, particularly the Gulf and Turkey, and even potentially Iran, if some sort of agreement or opening up of Iran occurs, that would be a huge shift in the region. It would open up its logistics capabilities. It would mean being more of a Belt and Road hub. So a lot of the region are elites I speak with. They're always talking about how the Iran deal would have massively benefited Central Asia and left it less landlocked and dependent on Russia and China. So that's another potential country that many of them court as a partner. But at present, the numbers simply, I mean, even looking at the arms transfers there, Turkey accounts for about 2%. It will be interesting to see whether it bolster its ambitions in response to Russian recidivism, but I think it's very unlikely to replace China.
I absolutely agree with that. So we're almost out of time, so maybe we can end with one question that looks forward into the future. So Russia is often seen as, a junior partner in its relationship with China, something that is becoming even more apparent as Russia becomes isolated from the global community. Its markets in Europe and the West start to decrease, and it becomes more reliant on China. I'm interested, what your take is on the issues. How will Russia's relationship with China change in the future, in part as a reaction to the war and Russia's increasing isolation? And what would be the consequences of this for Russia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the war has had really a profound shift in their dynamic. Of course, Russia's long been definitely perceived by China to be in decline. That's been certainly when I lived in Beijing, that was the attitude all the time, that Russia's this declining power, but still an important balancer actor. China has this long history of seeing itself in strategic triangles, the way that its conflict with the Soviet Union led to it becoming a partner with the United States. So China has this real fear of, this is really why they seek to prop up Putin, even in the face of what is clearly a very unjust war, and which has potential diplomatic or economic backlash prospects for China and its support of Russia. But ultimately, China fears more the prospect of a liberal-facing, pro-Western consensus emerging in Russia, which could lead to China feeling isolated, or even facing instability. If Russia was to descend into instability, then that would, of course, leave China exposed with its huge borders with the region. It could lead to instability spreading to Central Asia and into Xinjiang, at a time when China is locked in this global contest with the United States, and particularly focused more on the Asia Pacific. So these agreements with Russia and with Central Asia, especially the border agreements, the demilitarization agreements, they've been part of a long-standing strategy by which China seeks to be able to reduce its security commitments and its Western flank so that it can concentrate its resources on the Asia Pacific and its competition with the United States and developing its naval capabilities, which is where it sees its future. So I think that the conflict with Ukraine, it hasn't shifted those grand strategy ambitions of China, but it's definitely weakened Russia's hand. And I think that the ICC decision was kind of a great display of that, where it just shows Russia's marginalization, its reduction in its influence and really its bargaining power with China, which will stand to gain. And Russia, of course, really one area we're seeing China expanding its influence within Russia, and where I think we'll continue to see presence is the Arctic region. Russia's long been protective of the Arctic and controlling those trade routes as they start to open up. We're now seeing a lot more Chinese activity, including Chinese icebreakers in the Arctic. And I think that as Russia's bargaining power decreases, we'll probably see a lot more Chinese activity there as it seeks to have alternative trade routes to the Western Asia Pacific dominated routes.
Absolutely. Well, with that, we are out of time, but I would like to thank you very much for coming and speaking with us today and for taking the time out of your day to do so. This was fascinating discussion. I have so many questions for you still, so hopefully maybe we can talk further. But thank you for your time, and hopefully next time we can have you out here in Norman to talk further.
Yeah, I'd love to fly over.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and join me in thanking Mr. Jardine for his fascinating conversation with us.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Have a wonderful day.
Great. You too.